So the decision that changes everything is rarely the one that looks like it changes everything when it is being made. The ones that look significant from the outside, the formal announcements and the signed frameworks and the public statements, those are the visible surface of something that has already happened underneath, in the private interior of a person who has been moving toward a conclusion for longer than anyone around them realized. The actual decision, the one that matters, happens quietly. It happens in a garden or on a walk or at a kitchen table at the end of an ordinary evening when the children are in bed and the house is still and a person finds themselves on one side of something they had been approaching without quite seeing it, and then they are on the other side, and the crossing happens so quietly that they could not have said afterward exactly when it occurred. Harry's decision about his future in Britain happened that way, not in a meeting, not in response to a conversation or a document or an institutional development or anything that could be pointed to afterward as the thing that caused it. It happened in the accumulation of ordinary mornings in a country he had been living in for a year, each one adding something small to a weight that eventually tipped. And the tipping was the decision, and Harry understood it had happened before he understood what to do with the understanding. What he understood was this: he did not want to leave. Not in the way he had not wanted to leave things before, not in the ambivalent way of a person who prefers where they are to the alternative, but accepts the alternative as necessary, in the way of a person who has looked at a future without the thing they are considering and found the future without it unacceptable. He did not want to leave Britain. He did not want his children to leave Britain. He did not want the life that was assembling itself in the rhythm of the revised framework, the British schools and the English garden and the October light and his father answering on the second ring, to be the temporary thing the framework had been designed to accommodate rather than the permanent thing it had quietly become. He wanted to stay. The decision preceded the conversation with Meghan by 10 days. That gap is the part of this account that sources describe with the most care, because the gap is where the shock lives, not in the decision itself, which Meghan, when she heard it, found she was less surprised by than she might have expected, but in the discovery that Harry had been living with the decision for 10 days before he told her, and that the 10 days had been the time he needed to be certain before he offered it to anyone else, and that his certainty, in this as in the previous interview decision, had moved faster than the partnership required. He told her on a Sunday evening. The children were asleep. The house was the house they had been in for a year, the one that had settled around them in the way that houses settle when a family has been in them long enough to have filled the rooms with the particular accumulation of a lived life. Books in the wrong places and shoes by the wrong doors and the small territorial markings of children who have decided a space is theirs. Meghan was reading. Harry came and sat across from her and waited until she looked up, which she did after a moment, reading him the way she reads him, completely and quickly. He told her he wanted to stay. He told her he did not mean for the length of the current arrangement. He told her he meant permanently. He told her he had been thinking about it for 10 days and that he was as certain of it as he had been of anything in a long time, which was more certain than she might expect, given the history of large decisions in their life together, some of which he had been certain of and right about, and some of which he had been certain of and wrong about, and the pattern of which she knew better than anyone. Meghan put her book down. She did not speak immediately, which is, sources note, different from her usual register when Harry tells her something significant, because Meghan's usual register is quick and precise, and she arrives at her response fast, faster than Harry does, faster than most people in a room do, and when she does not speak immediately, it means she is holding something that requires more than her usual processing speed. She held it for long enough that Harry asked if she was all right. She said she was. She said she was thinking. He said he could tell. She said she needed him to tell her everything, not the decision, but the interior of the decision, the 10 days, what he had been thinking and how it had assembled and why it had landed where it landed, because she needed to understand the shape of the thing before she could respond to it, and the shape she was already forming from what he had said was not the shape she had expected to be forming at this point in their life, and she needed to know whether her shape matched his. He told her everything. He told her about the morning 6 weeks after they arrived, when he had walked to the end of the lane before the children were up, and had stood in the early light, and had felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the specific sensation of being in the right place without having to argue himself into the feeling. He told her about the afternoon he had watched Lilibet and her school friend from down the road running across the garden, two small girls in the English summer with nowhere to be and nothing required of them, and had understood that what he was watching was childhood in the form he had wanted for his daughter and had not known how to provide until he was providing it. He told her about the morning Archie had come downstairs wearing his school uniform without being asked, and had eaten his breakfast and picked up his bag and said, "See you later, Dad," in the casual way of a child for whom this is simply the morning, not an occasion, just the morning. And Harry had stood in the kitchen after Archie left and had been unable to account for what he felt, except that it was something in the category of rightness, the sense of a thing being as it should be. He told her about Scotland, about the fire and his father's voice, and the pride that had been offered without condition or occasion, and what it had done to the place in him where that had been missing. He told her that the missing of it had shaped more of his decisions than he had ever fully acknowledged, that the hunger for his father's unconditional regard had been a force operating inside him for decades, and that the Scotland weekend had given him something that changed the force, not eliminated it, but changed it, from a hunger that drove him toward and away from things in ways he could not always predict, into something quieter and more stable, and that the stability had cleared a space in which he could see his own life more clearly than he had been able to see it for years. What he saw in the cleared space was Britain, not the institution, not the monarchy, not any of the formal dimensions of what being in Britain meant for his family's constitutional position and the children's relationship to the line of succession and the revised framework and all the rest of it. Britain, the place, the lane and the garden and the school at the end of the road, and his father answering on the second ring, and the October light that he had grown up in and had missed without knowing he missed it until he was back in it and could feel the missing Phil. He saw himself in it, not as a visitor, not as a person in an arrangement that had a defined rhythm and an institutional framework and a calendar of weeks and a coordination process, as a resident, as a person whose life was here in the way that a person's life is somewhere, when the somewhere is not a choice being made, but a fact being acknowledged. He wanted to stay. Meghan listened to all of it. She listened with the quality of attention she gives to things that are going to require her to locate herself in relation to something large, which is the full version of herself, not the managed version, the actual one. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she had known. He said he had not thought she had known. She said she had not known he had decided. She said she had known something was changing in him, and that the direction of the change was the direction it had landed. She said she had been watching it for months and had been waiting to see where it would stop, and it had stopped where she thought it would stop and where she had been hoping it would stop, because the alternative was the thought she had not been allowing herself to finish, which was what it would mean to leave Britain now, after a year of the children in those schools and Lilibet and the girl from down the road and Archie putting on his uniform without being asked, what it would mean to take that apart and return to California and say to the children that the thing they had built here was not the permanent thing it had felt like to them. She had not wanted to think about that. She had been not thinking about it for months, with the determined discipline of a person who knows that the thought is there but is not ready to examine it. Harry's decision meant she did not have to discipline herself against it any longer. The thing she had been not thinking about was not going to happen. They were staying. He had decided. She agreed. She said yes before he asked whether she agreed, which is the form that agreement takes between people who have been together long enough that the positions arrive before the questions. He said he needed to hear her say it. She said yes. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Do not thank me." She said, "This is also my life and also my children and also my choice." And she was choosing it the same as he was, and he should not thank her for a choice she was making for her own reasons, not as a concession to his certainty. He said he understood. She said she would need some time to work through what it meant for the professional life she had built in California. Not because she was unwilling to make the adjustments the decision required, but because the adjustments required thought, and she needed to be the one who thought about them rather than receiving a plan someone else had devised. He said, of course. She said she also needed to know that the decision was theirs, not his alone that she was endorsing, and that when they told people about it, the telling would reflect that it was a joint decision rather than Harry's decision that Meghan had agreed to. Harry said it was a joint decision. Meghan said it was now. He understood the distinction, and he accepted it. The telling happened in a sequence that sources describe as more carefully ordered than the interview and more carefully ordered than the announcement of the return, which is to say, Harry and Meghan together had thought about who needed to know and in what order before any contact was made, and the thinking had produced a sequence that reflected their understanding of the relationships rather than the institutional hierarchy, which was a different sequence from the one the palace would have designed. They told the children first. That was not the institutionally correct sequence, and it was not the sequence that anyone in a coordination role would have recommended. It was the right sequence because Archie and Lilibet were the people most directly affected, and because Harry and Meghan had agreed early in the conversation about how to handle the decision that the children's understanding of it would shape everything that followed, and they wanted the children's response before they had offered the decision to anyone whose reaction might complicate the conversation with the children. Archie heard it with the composure of a child who has been half expecting something and is relieved to have the half expectation resolved. He asked whether he could stay at his school. Harry said yes. Archie said good because he had a football thing in the spring. Harry said he knew. Archie said right then and went back to what he had been doing, which was the complete and immediate incorporation of a significant life development that children perform when the development is a good one and they are fundamentally secure, the security doing the work of processing so that the child does not have to perform the processing visibly. Lilibet asked whether they were going to keep the house. Meghan said yes. Lilibet asked whether she was going to keep seeing the girl from down the road. Harry said yes. Lilibet said she was glad because they had a plan. He asked what the plan was. She said it was private. He said fair enough. Charles was told the following morning. Harry called him on a Wednesday before 9, which Charles noted afterward to his private secretary was the first time in the period since the return that Harry had called before 9 in the morning, which was not an insignificant detail to a man who knows his son well enough to know that a call before 9 means something has been decided rather than something being considered. He answered, and Harry told him in the direct way he had learned to communicate with his father in the period since Scotland, without preamble and without the managed language that had previously characterized their formal communications, that he and Meghan had decided to make Britain their permanent home. Charles was quiet for the duration that sources describe as longer than his Scotland pause and shorter than the original framework pause, which places it somewhere between processing and composure. Then he said, was Harry sure? Harry said yes. Charles said, and Meghan. Harry said Meghan's yes came first. Charles was quiet again for a shorter period, and then he said something that sources describe only as personal and declined to characterize further, protecting the interior of a moment that belongs to a father and his son rather than to an account of the family's institutional life. Harry said he knew in response to whatever Charles had said. The call ended shortly afterward. Charles sat in his study for 20 minutes after it ended. He did not pick up the drawing on his desk. He did not need to. He already knew what it was. William was told by Charles rather than by Harry, which was the sequence Harry and Meghan had agreed on, and which reflected an understanding of the relationship between the brothers that had developed through the preceding year. which was that significant things involving the institution were told to William through channels that preserved the institutional hierarchy, while significant things between the brothers personally were handled differently. This was an institutional thing. Charles told William. William received it in the controlled way he receives things from Charles about Harry, the way that has developed over a year of receiving things, less braced than it was, more genuinely open to the content rather than the management of the content. He asked one question. He asked whether the decision was final or whether final was a word Harry was using for something that was still subject to the same kind of revision that previous final decisions had been subject to. Charles said he thought it was final. He said it with the particular quality of a father who knows his son well enough to know the difference between a decision that has been made in the cleared space that Scotland had provided and a decision that has been made in the urgency of feeling, and that this was the former rather than the latter. William heard the quality of it and accepted it. He did not call Harry immediately. He waited until the following day, which was the form that William's respect for significant moments had taken over the course of the year, giving things room rather than filling the room immediately. When he called, the conversation was, sources describe, not the conversation that would have happened a year earlier, not the managed exchange of two men navigating a complex shared situation with careful language and considerable restraint. It was something more like brothers, not uncomplicated, not without the history and the things that remained unresolved between them, but more like brothers than it had been in a long time. William asked how Archie had taken it. Harry said Archie had a football thing in the spring and was primarily focused on the football thing. William said that sounded about right. Harry asked how George was doing with the rugby. William said George had strong opinions about his position that the coach did not entirely share. Harry said that sounded familiar. William said that was the first time Harry had made a joke about their childhood that had landed correctly in several years. Harry said he was out of practice. William said he would get it back. The institutional response to the decision was managed through the revised coordination process, which this time Harry had used from the beginning. Having learned from the interview that moving before coordinating produced outcomes that were worse for him than the coordination process itself, and that the protection of his voice that he had been trying to preserve by bypassing the process was better preserved by using the process correctly than by bypassing it. The coordination team prepared the public language with Harry and Meghan's active participation, Meghan in particular contributing the framing that sources describe as the most accurate public characterization of what the decision actually was, which was a family choosing a home rather than an institution choosing an arrangement. That distinction drove the language of the announcement. It was a family choosing a home. The institutional dimensions were real and would be addressed through the existing framework and the existing processes and the existing relationships that had been built over the preceding year. But the decision itself was personal. It was two parents and two children and a house in England and a girl from down the road and a football thing in the spring and a grandfather who answered on the second ring. The announcement was received by the press in the ways that announcements involving Harry and Meghan are always received, which is to say with the full range of responses that the division of public opinion about them reliably produces, some welcoming and some skeptical, and some invested in reading the institutional implications, and some invested in the personal narrative, and some simply noting that a thing had happened and recording that it had happened. None of the responses were the response Harry had been most concerned about, which was the response of someone pointing at the decision and characterizing it as a return to the institution in the formal sense, as Harry and Meghan rejoining the working royal family, because the announcement was precise enough about what it was, and was not that the characterization was not available to anyone reading carefully. William issued no public response. The palace noted the announcement and made no further comment. Anne made no comment of any kind, which was entirely consistent with her approach to every development in this process. and which Harry had come to understand through the year of being back in the country where she was, as the highest form of endorsement she offered, the complete absence of comment being the thing she produced when a situation had been handled correctly and there was nothing that needed to be said. Harry was in the garden when the announcement went out. He had arranged this deliberately, being in the garden rather than watching the coverage or monitoring the responses or doing any of the things that a person in his situation could reasonably be expected to do when something they have decided becomes public. He was in the garden because the garden was where he was when the decision made itself known to him, in the accumulated weight of ordinary mornings, and it seemed right to be there when it became something the world knew about. It was November by this point. The English November garden is not the same as the English summer garden, and it is certainly not the California garden, which is a different thing entirely, in the way that places that are warm when the year should be cooling are different things from places that behave as the year requires. The English November garden is bare in the way that things are bare when they are resting rather than dying. The particular bare of something that will come back, that is simply absent for the season before the season turns. Harry stood in it and understood that this was his garden, not in the own sense, not in the institutional sense, not in the sense of any framework or arrangement or document that bore his name in relation to a property, in the sense of a man who has stood in the same piece of ground often enough that the ground knows him. His garden, his country, his children's school at the end of the lane, and his father's voice on the second ring, and his wife's reading chair in the room at the back of the house where the light was good in the afternoon. The words sat in him without the weight it had carried at various points in his life, without the complications that possession and belonging had accumulated through the years of his royal childhood and his estrangement and his California life and the long, careful building of the return. It was just a word, a simple word describing a simple fact. He was here. He was staying. This was his. He stood in the bare November garden until the cold made standing in it impractical, and then he went inside. Meghan was on the phone to her production team in California, managing the professional dimensions of the permanent arrangement with the efficiency that characterized her management of everything, her voice carrying through the kitchen in the way of someone who is entirely at home in the space they are occupying. He listened to the sound of it for a moment from the hallway, the sound of Meghan working in their house in England, and felt the rightness of it in the way he had been feeling the rightness of ordinary things for a year, quietly and without needing to explain it to anyone. He went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. She glanced up from the call and he held up the kettle inquiringly. She nodded without interrupting her sentence. He made 2 cups of tea. He put one beside her and took the other to the table and sat down with it, and the particular contentment of a man who has been somewhere for long enough that the somewhere has become ordinary. The contentment was not simple. Nothing in Harry's life had ever been simple, and the contentment did not simplify the things that were not simple. The things between him and William that remained unresolved. The history between him and the institution that had formed him and damaged him, and that he was now choosing proximity to remained history. The complexity of what he and Meghan had built and were building and would continue to build in a life that spanned 2 countries and 2 professional worlds and 2 versions of who they were and who their children were, that complexity remained. He was not in a life without complexity. He was in the right life. The 2 things were not the same, and he had learned in the year of being back to hold them both at once without requiring the complexity to be resolved before he allowed himself the contentment. He sat with his tea. Meghan finished her call. She came and sat across from him at the kitchen table in the same configuration as the Sunday evening when he had told her. The same table, the same 2 people. The same low evening light coming through the kitchen window in the English November way. She picked up her tea. He picked up his. She said she was going to need to fly to California in January for a run of production meetings. He said he knew. She said it would be 2 weeks. He said he would manage. She said obviously he would manage. She was a competent adult. He said he was glad she had noticed. She said she had been noticing for some time. He said good. She drank her tea. He drank his. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet when the children were asleep and the day had done what it needed to do and the evening had arrived and settled, the particular quiet of a family at rest in a place they had chosen. Outside, the November garden was dark. Tomorrow, it would be there in the morning when Harry walked to the end of the lane before the children were up and stood in the early light in the country that was his, in the way that a person's country is theirs when they have been in it long enough to stop noticing it and start simply being in it, which is the only way of belonging that actually counts. He would stand in it tomorrow and the day after, and in the spring when Archie had his football thing, and in the summer when Lilibet would find a lizard near the fence and would call her grandfather and he would answer on the second ring. He would be here for all of it. That was the decision. That was all it was, and that was everything it was. A man choosing to be in the place where being was right and staying there. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.